Here are six things God hates, and one more that he loathes with a passion: an eyes that are arrogant, a tongue that lies, hands that murder the innocent, a heart that hatches evil plots, feet that race down a wicked track, a mouth that lies under oath, and a troublemaker. Fundamental to the construct of the Confederate's wizard communism, which actively engages in defrauding the government by their criminal censorships of the most essential pieces of information in order to subsequently change the outcome according to their subversive algorithms, which generate their ability to censor and edit the thing, creating an alternative context. There once was a meme showing a man that was running away from a murderer with a knife. And they're both just blocked out stick figures. And the news reports on it. And it shows the man running away as the attacker. The foot he's using to run away with looks like the knife from their point of view context, which generates the pretense of who is guilty of what. And then the panned out view shows that the one running away is not the attacker. And this fundamentally summarizes the context of many of their subversive operations, as the core identity of their terrorist operations generates these fraudulent obscuring of the base pieces of information, at which point you would not understand who to hate and who to love. And thus, they designed it specifically by their wizard loyalties for their favoritism towards witchcraft, that you should love the criminal and that you should hate the victim, and loathing entirely the victim for the lack of morality derived by the context of their victimhood generates the absolute force that should be conducted against such subversive to society. But far be it from justice to have any involvement in any of their dealings. It is important to understand that they seek to revolutionize the law. Confederates threatened the United States national security by insurgent terrorists for the function of hate crimes, which includes the function of 7 ways to Sunday in order to retaliate against anyone who opposes them, including the threatening of judges, senators, and congressmen of all forms, and legislators of all forms, and executives of all forms, and basically any executive, judge, legislator, or any American function would then be subordinate to a malicious subversive terrorist organization, which would then view itself as above the law and thus being beyond the capacity of recourse, which is usurpation and insurrection. And these acts of high treason, sedition, and all forms of offenses which have become normal activities inside this corrupt system of the enemies of these United States generates exponential weaknesses by their corruption, as all corruption has done in all forms, in every system. At which point you cannot solve your problems with the same thinking that created them in the first place. And to that extent, you would have to completely remove all the corruption in order to start solving the corrupt problems. The activity of allowing the felony system from Wall Street and the banks, etc., which have actively been leveraging the Marines and sheriffs, etc., in order to systematically support their criminal operations, such as their surveillance child predatory systems, where they criminally classify their activities, specifically breaking every form of law in order to maintain their personal lusts in favor of their arbitrary interests. And those who seek to defend the policies created for these operations is part and parcel to those offenses. Understand that you adulterous people who support the Confederates and their criminal activities. Do you not understand that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be friends with the world makes himself an enemy of God. Therefore, having put away your falsehoods, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. They claim that they are there to engage in judging of those that they deem justifiable in order to rob for the spoils of their war. At which point they are no different than the function of Jezebel, who is their core sorceress and identity for their specific idolatries. As Jezebel looked upon her husband, who lusted after a vineyard from someone who would not give the vineyard to him, and it would be illegal for him to give the king the vineyard. And thus Jezebel found worthless men in order to create frauds against the system, clever illusions by her sorceries and her witchcrafts, much like the Confederates and their secret operations, criminalizing the evidence, specifically proving their guilt in the particulars, and thus generate for themselves their own worthless men, to likewise convict on false charges the victim to be spoiled, at which point the garden is then given to them, and the owner is then killed. And thus you have the activities of their active loyalty to deceit, fraud, murder, and theft, like their father Satan, and to the function of the obligation to engage in the duel, which is a function of the acknowledgement of David's obstructed title by Congress to recognize that obstructed title at that time, recognizes the responsibilities of the intelligence oversight position dismantled by their Confederate insurrections, proving their malice and hatred of the country and everything that it stands for, and its capability of survival is generated perpetually as a primary fear of theirs, as they avoid it maliciously, as they are exclusively loyal to their dirty tricks, and thus any pretense of competent judgment would by definition nullify their judgment. And thus the position of judge not lest you be judged is not a statement of don't judge, but a statement that you will be judged by the same metric that you have judged. And those who greedily seek after this are, in most cases, guilty of the very same violation of the standards by which they protest too much, as their sorceries prove their criminal intent. For you are not guiltless if you do the violation of the thing in the enforcement of the act by which states you should not do the thing, and thus they making the violation in order to engage in opposition to that very same thing are engaged in fraud and are guilty of the offenses, at which point the manifestation of their interest in the laundering of their offenses generates their criminal subversions covertly, as though the function of their sorcery should be immune from any legitimate speculation, and in the examination would prove their faults, and thus the examination amongst God, who has also examined their faults, has seen them in the judgment that counts as to be wanting, and these compounding liabilities which they have generated in these pursuits for their illegitimate gains by their murders and their spoils against their fellow men, their countrymen, who they've stabbed in the back by their false pretenses, denoting their position of status and respectability as the cover, as though it was an excuse for their behavior, as though they, being God themselves, can determine for the general population, as though they were royal priests with divinity, that they should choose their equal man to be designed for honor or for dishonor by virtue of their spiritual enlightenment or their position or wealth or whatever mishap has brought upon them the delusion from their confederates KKK and its wizard hierarchy, generating the pretense of the degrees of occult knowledge, proving their godhood, that at the lowest level of their occult knowledge generates goodwill to all, and at their degree of occult knowledge, goodwill to God themselves. And as they are God themselves, there is no place for the God of creation, the demiurge, their rejected adversary, who could only potentially threaten the life they wish to pursue themselves. It is said that their secret wizard clans has engaged in the witches' coven in order to attack the Firbolg, or the function of those who they believe is connected to David, as the function of the legitimate engagement in the general structure of society on Earth, as the world is understood as the population of the sum total of humanity is interconnected with the ideals of Earth, and thus they engage in all kinds of wordplay, or the function of the manipulation of definition for spells in order to express their specific interest, and in the dismantlement of their opposition, and to this extent engage in their terrorism, and as they express their assumption of what they believe was and is legitimate, can then become their adversary, as in the function of their gnostic loyalties in their Druid priesthood, that which is normal has to become abnormal, and that which is abnormal must become normal, and thus you have this series of checkpoints specifically designed by which to establish these subversive alterations, and under the position of Freswu-Bulul, the demon lord of deceit, you have these subtle changes which have at its most luxurious tastes and sweet luxuries, as the conversion of the good into degenerate evil, all of the while, during its corruption, having absolute confidence in its good, and at the conclusion is to be devoured by the evil it actually worships. Their loyalty to lawlessness is founded in their druid priesthood, which actively seeks the conversion of all other religions into itself, and thus in the engagement has even collapsed to overthrow the American Constitution and all of its laws, and thus there is no longer a consideration of the rule of law, merely anarcho extra law. And in this anarcho extra law, you have the system which generates normal subversive democracy, as is explained in Greece. And upon the position that the Druids can no longer settle from this democracy, from their Soviets, it creates a position of civil war amongst the covert terrorist actions. And thus the clan will then subvert an attack against itself as the espionage insurgent terrorists descend against each other in the spy versus spy operations until they purge the other and find out who is the right type of white. They have sold themselves to the self-destruction of their lawless insurrection as insurgent terrorists conducting clan contracts similar to the historic clan operations of hate crimes and terrorism against the black community, which are their original adversaries as the white supremacist communism seeks to subjugate and control by their criminal subversions for their invisible empire. And this engagement systemically traumatizes the general public and only tolerates vaguely crony capitalism as it manipulates its monopolies and inflates the currencies and destroys the system by all kinds of subversive tricks. At which point the active maintenance of their finances is frauds and felonies, which compounds to the purpose of neo-feudalism and the road to serfdom, which then dictates the abject slavery and dominance over all parties, including their subversive invasion of privacy into homes without cause arbitrarily on the basis of their blackmail structure, which generates their ability to engage in their Soviet threats, which, similar to the Russians, has the compulsion of the rape culture that if you challenge anything that they claim for their sexual lusts and appetites would then be met with severe punishments. And thus the activity requires the understanding of the Bible and the things that the Lord hates, because those are the things that these Satanists lust after. As the worship of Satan is for the purpose of liberty from God, and thus the liberty from the laws of God, and thus liberty from liberty, or the necessary discipline in order to engage in the function of self-preservation and self-development for the pursuit of one's own happiness. As they become entangled by their addictions, they then no longer have the choice as they become prisoners to their sin. Can you solve corruption with corruption? The answer inevitably becomes no. Similar to the function of many people who engage in day trading, the activities of your ability to make lots of money becomes inevitable for them often to lose, as the activity requires a degree of professionality not specifically crafted for those who are allured to cheap returns. and thus those who engage in that often lose track and thus purge themselves of their additional resources. As the system of corruptions systemically oppose the position of order and progress, they become dragged back and subjugate themselves to their various cons, as they degrade into abject nothingness, as they dissolve into the ooze of their God, which has deluded them into nothing more than socialist peasants. And the socialist peasants are all equally poor. And that is the blessings of socialism from the white supremacy, that you will all become equally poor. And those who are more equal than others will fight with others who are claiming to be more equal than others, as they actively fight over the supremacy and dominance under the religion of the Norse. So we shall go over Abraham Lincoln, a keen mind in these ideals of Confederacy or constitutional law. Those who would preserve liberty for the sake of equality under law versus the domination of slavery by the wizards and their various terrorisms by corruption. Abraham Lincoln. Those who would deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea on democracy. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not because it would help to save the Union. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. We were proclaiming ourselves political hypocrites before the world by thus fostering human slavery and proclaiming ourselves at the same time the sole friends of human freedom. Slavery is founded on the selfishness of man's nature, opposition to it on his love of justice. These principles are in the eternal anguish, antagonism, and when brought to collision so fiercely as slavery extends, brings them, shocks and throes and convulsions must ceaselessly follow. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. This is a world of compensations, and he who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives a republican example of its just influence in the world. I know there is a God, and that he hates injustice and slavery. I see the storm coming, and I know that his hands is in it, if he has a place and work for me, and I think he has. I believe I am ready. In giving freedom to the slaves, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose, and the last best hope on earth. In, in 1841, you and I together had tedious low water drip on the steamboat from Louisiana to St. Louis. You may remember, as I well do, that from Louisville to the mouth of Ohio, there were on board 10 or a dozen slaves, shackled together with irons. That sight was a continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio or any other slave born. In 2003, the Supreme Court says any unnecessary use of force shocks the conscience. And in the enforcement of this construct has proven itself on who does or do not have a conscience in order to progress. And thus the function of the terrorist Confederates have engaged in slave raids and terrorism operations, violating that precedent, proving their inhumanity. And thus it is necessary to understand that they are in fact not humans and cannot be considered to have a soul, as they have rejected God in favor of their Luciferian sorcery. The example is such criminal operations violating the Constitution, such as William Bard's pre-crime operations, which have at it the position of a false reasonable assumption which cannot be processed by courts, as that is a direct violation of acquiring a warrant. But whereas a warrant is reasonable assumption in order to investigate further, this would be an absolute function as an executive action, or the engagement of a slave raid, as these arbitrary terrorisms seek out the elites and political opponents, who would then undermine the progress of the white supremacists and its enforcement of their communism, such as the Twitter files engagement for fascism, the carrot and the stick, the threat of the violence and punishments, as well as the beneficial rewards. As the president of Quest in the 1990s discovered that the stick from false accusations from this engagement of fraud by the FBI, which has been corrupted by the Confederacy, has laundered its policies of slavery against the Americans without purpose or cause, has engaged in usurpations of all kinds, and thus the act of insurrection. And in these acts of insurrection have targeted for voter fraud off of these engagements, substantively overturning the elections in favor of the white supremacists. The greedy aspects of these mindless degenerates must be understood under their false claim of states' rights. And their claim of these states' rights are subversives against the federal government and the authority of the federal constitution. And as that, they generate for themselves the posturing in order to enforce against other sovereign states the compulsion by coercion as to subjugate them as a second federal government unto itself, claiming the favor of their liberty, of their states' rights, but not the rights of other states, and thus the subjugation of those who prefer a competent rule of law are then targeted maliciously by an expanse of manifest destiny as they spread over to conquer the rest of any law-abiding system, as they themselves do not have a limit to their ambition, and to the extent that they are too incapable of generating for themselves is the extent that they rely upon raids in order to extort from others.